She won't last a week. Those were the first words Duke Corvin Blackmere ever spoke about Thessaly Varnum. He barely glanced through the rain-streaked window as her carriage pulled toward the front steps of the estate. His butler, Huxley, stood beside him, holding a folded letter requesting shelter and purpose for the eldest daughter of a declining family. Corvin turned away before the carriage door even opened. See that she is given a room in the East Corridor and kept far from the wedding preparations. I will not have a stranger wandering through my household during the most important season of my life. Huxley nodded once. And if Miss Varnum inquires about her duties, Your Grace, assign her to my grandmother. That should exhaust her patience within days. Those words were spoken on a cold February morning beneath gray skies that pressed low against the Blackmere estate like a ceiling of iron. Several months later, Thessaly Varnum still had not left, and by then, everything inside the estate had changed. The night before the wedding, 140 guests filled the Blackmere ballroom for the rehearsal dinner. Crystal chandeliers illuminated tables overflowing with poached lobster tails, herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted root vegetables glazed in brown butter, and an enormous tiered cake decorated with spun sugar flowers and edible gold leaf. Wine from 4 different countries filled crystal glasses that caught the candlelight like liquid amber. Delphinia Sable, the future Duchess, presided over the head table beside Corvin, radiant in pale silver silk, embroidered with tiny crystals, her auburn curls arranged beneath diamond pins. She held the room effortlessly, laughing with practiced elegance, while titled guests leaned toward her, captivated. Halfway through supper, Delphinia rose to deliver a toast. "Tomorrow begins the life I have waited for," she announced beautifully. "I promise to honor every part of the Blackmere legacy." Applause filled the hall. Glasses rose across the room. Then Huxley appeared at Corvin's shoulder and whispered something that drained the color from the Duke's face. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped against the marble floor. Guests turned in alarm. "Is something wrong, darling?" Delphinia's smile held perfectly. "My grandmother is unwell." Delphinia's expression tightened. "Corvin, we have 140 guests. Surely the servants can manage until after dessert." Corvin stopped walking. He turned slowly and looked at Delphinia with an expression that the nearest guests would describe to friends and neighbors for months afterward. Then he walked out of his own rehearsal dinner without another word. And what happened in the hours that followed destroyed everything Delphinia Sable had spent months building. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories of betrayal, heartbreak, and unexpected vindication, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us bring these unforgettable stories to you every single day. Now, let us return to the beginning. Thessaly Varnum had spent 29 years learning how to become invisible inside her own home. The Varnum estate in Willowmere had once been considered among the finest properties in the southern counties. Tall limestone walls surrounded manicured gardens where peacocks wandered freely between sculpted hedgerows and marble fountains. Inside, mahogany staircases curved beneath ceilings, painted with pastoral scenes of shepherds and golden meadows. Porcelain vases from Florence lined every corridor, and the library held nearly 4,000 leather-bound volumes collected across 3 generations. But wealth had been draining from the Varnum family for years, the way water leaves a cracked basin, slowly enough that nobody notices until the basin stands empty. Lord Fenwick Varnum continued hosting elaborate dinners as though nothing had changed. He ordered new curtains for rooms nobody entered. He purchased horses he could not afford to stable. And he maintained appearances with the desperate energy of a man who believed reputation alone could hold reality together. Lady Margot supported every decision without question, because questioning Lord Fenwick publicly meant admitting the decline was real. Together, they performed prosperity so convincingly that most of Willowmere society never suspected the truth. Their younger daughters helped sustain the illusion effortlessly. Ondine, the middle daughter, possessed a sharp beauty that drew attention the moment she entered any room. She dressed expensively, spoke with careful wit, and attracted suitors with the precision of someone who understood exactly what her appearance was worth. Lucette, the youngest, compensated for what she lacked in Ondine's striking looks with relentless charm and social ambition. She memorized guest lists before parties, studied which families held rising influence, and positioned herself beside the right people, with instincts that impressed even Lady Margot. Between them, the two younger Varnum daughters consumed nearly every resource the family had left: gown fittings, imported perfumes, jewelry cleaned and reset for each season, carriage rentals for London events. Lady Margot justified every expense as investment toward future marriages that would restore the family permanently. Thessaly received none of it. As the eldest daughter, she had once been the family's greatest hope. At 20, she played the fortepiano beautifully during evening gatherings, discussed literature with visiting scholars, and carried a quiet warmth that guests remembered long after leaving the estate. Gentlemen had asked Lord Fenwick for introductions on several occasions during those early years. But Thessaly never performed her value loudly enough. She lacked Ondine's sharpness and Lucette's social instincts. She spoke too honestly during dinners, recommended books nobody wanted to read, and treated servants with a familiarity that made Lady Margot visibly uncomfortable during formal gatherings. By 25, invitations addressed to her specifically had stopped arriving. By 27, visitors to the estate sometimes mistook her for a governess or paid companion rather than the eldest daughter of the household. By 29, her own family had largely stopped correcting the mistake. Her daily life inside the estate reflected the erasure completely. She managed household accounts that Lord Fenwick refused to examine himself. She oversaw kitchen inventories, resolved disputes among servants, arranged flowers for gatherings she was no longer seated prominently at, and quietly repaired the countless small emergencies that kept the Varnum household functioning while everyone else performed elegance above her. Nobody thanked her. Nobody acknowledged the work existed. During meals, conversations flowed around her as though her chair were empty. Ondine discussed opera performances in London, while Lucette recounted compliments received at recent gatherings. Lady Margot listened attentively to both, offering advice and encouragement with visible pride. When Thessaly occasionally mentioned something, a passage from a book she had been reading, a problem among the tenants, silence briefly replaced conversation before someone changed the subject. One afternoon, while arranging fresh lavender bundles inside the linen closets, Thessaly overheard Lady Margot speaking with a visiting cousin in the drawing room below. The younger girls remain our priority. Ondine's prospects are excellent this season, and Lucette improves her position constantly. A brief pause followed. Thessaly is useful here, of course. Someone must manage things. But it would be unrealistic to expect anything further from her situation. The cousin murmured something sympathetic that Thessaly could not hear clearly. Lady Margot continued calmly. At her age, without connections or beauty worth mentioning, hope becomes an unkindness. It is better for everyone if expectations remain practical. Thessaly stood motionless in the corridor above, holding lavender stems so tightly that the stalks bent and snapped between her fingers. Then she continued working as though she had heard nothing at all, because that was what she had learned to do inside the Varnum household. She continued. She endured, and she disappeared further into the fabric of a home that had forgotten she was anything more than the woman who kept it running. At church, whispers followed her the same way they followed every unmarried woman, past a certain age in Willowmere. Pity from the older women, nervous fascination from the younger ones, studying her as though studying a cautionary tale they were determined never to repeat. Thessaly sat beside her family each Sunday, dressed modestly while her sisters glittered, and kept her expression steady enough that nobody could see what the whispers cost her. The arrangement with the Blackmere estate arrived unexpectedly through a letter carried by a private courier on a Tuesday morning in late January. The Dowager Duchess, Isabeau Blackmere, grandmother of Duke Corvin Blackmere, required a companion following the recent departure of her previous attendant. Lady Margot had distant family connections to the Blackmere household through a marriage 2 generations removed, and the Dowager Duchess had apparently remembered Thessaly from a brief meeting years earlier. Lord Fenwick read the letter twice before setting it beside his breakfast plate. This removes an embarrassment and creates an obligation from one of the wealthiest families in England. She leaves within the fortnight. Thessaly was not consulted. She was informed. On the morning of her departure, rain fell steadily across the Varnum estate, while servants loaded a single trunk into the waiting carriage. Neither Undine nor Lucette came downstairs to say goodbye. Lady Margot offered a brief embrace near the front door and whispered something about representing the family with dignity. Lord Fenwick nodded once from behind his study window without opening it. As the carriage pulled away through the iron gates, Thessaly watched the estate grow smaller through the rain-blurred glass until the limestone walls disappeared entirely behind the gray hills of Willowmere. She carried no expectations with her, only the quiet, practiced ability to endure whatever came next. And what came next was the Blackmere estate, where she was expected to fail. The Blackmere servants tested Thessaly carefully during her first days inside the estate, as household staff always test newcomers whose authority remains unclear. They responded slowly to her requests. They delivered meals to her room later than necessary. They answered questions about the Dowager Duchess with deliberate vagueness designed to make her feel unwelcome without providing anything specific enough to complain about. Thessaly noticed every gesture and responded to none of them with frustration. Instead, on her second morning, she rose before dawn and found the kitchen herself. The head cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Britta, who had managed the Blackmere kitchens for over 20 years, discovered Thessaly carefully preparing a tray of warm broth, buttered toast, thinly sliced pear, and chamomile tea, arranged precisely the way the Dowager Duchess preferred, based on notes Thessaly had discreetly gathered from a retired maid in the village the previous evening. Britta watched from the doorway without speaking for several moments. "You went to the village to ask how she takes her breakfast." Thessaly looked up briefly. "She has particular preferences. I thought it better to learn them correctly rather than guess." Something shifted in Britta's expression. Not warmth yet, but the beginning of respect. She stepped forward and adjusted the position of the teacup on the tray. The chamomile goes on her left side. Her right hand trembles in the mornings, and she does not like reaching across. "Thank you." The exchange lasted fewer than 30 seconds, but by the following day, Thessaly's meals arrived on time. Her duties with the Dowager Duchess Isabeau filled most daylight hours. The elderly woman was fierce, particular, and deeply lonely behind the sharp intelligence that still burned inside her, despite the body slowly failing around it. Previous companions had lasted between 2 weeks and 3 months before requesting reassignment or simply departing without explanation. Isabeau frightened people. She spoke bluntly about death, asked intrusive personal questions within minutes of meeting someone, and refused to tolerate conversation she considered foolish, which included most conversation offered to elderly women by people who assumed age had softened their minds. Thessaly handled her differently than anyone expected. When Isabeau criticized the embroidery Thessaly was working on during their first afternoon together, calling the stitching careless and the color selection uninspired, Thessaly examined the piece calmly and agreed. "You are right. The green is wrong for this pattern. What would you suggest instead?" Isabeau blinked, clearly expecting argument or wounded silence. Neither arrived. Over the following weeks, their relationship developed through a series of small, genuine exchanges rather than performed companionship. Thessaly read aloud from volumes of natural history that Isabeau selected, and when passages confused her, she asked real questions rather than pretending understanding. She learned that the Dowager Duchess despised roses but loved wildflowers, preferred savory biscuits over sweet ones, and became irritable not from cruelty, but from pain in her joints that she refused to acknowledge openly. And slowly, in the trust that grew between them during long afternoons beside the fire, Thessaly found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud before, including the story of a young physician in Willowmere who had once loved her for exactly who she was and what his loss had cost her. One rainy afternoon, Thessaly found Isabeau struggling with the buttons on her morning coat, fingers trembling with frustration, while pride prevented her from calling a maid. Thessaly entered quietly and simply began fastening the buttons without comment, as though helping were the most ordinary thing in the world. She never mentioned the moment afterward. Isabeau never forgot it. Beyond the Dowager Duchess, Thessaly's kindness spread unseen throughout the household in ways she never intended anyone to notice. When a young kitchen boy named Phelim burned his arm badly on a pot handle and stood crying in the corridor, terrified of being scolded for carelessness, Thessaly knelt beside him, cleaned the burn carefully with cool water, wrapped it with a cloth soaked in solve she kept in her apron from treating Isabeau's aching hands, and walked him back to the kitchen herself, calmly explaining to Britta that the pot handle needed replacing before someone was hurt more seriously. She framed the injury as the household's failure rather than the child's. Phelim was comforted instead of punished. Britta ordered the handle replaced that afternoon. When an elderly groundskeeper named Aldous was discovered sleeping inside the garden shed during working hours, the head steward prepared a formal reprimand. Thessaly intervened privately, explaining that she had noticed Aldous struggling with shortness of breath for several days and had asked him to rest inside the shed rather than collapse outdoors in the February cold. She requested that the estate physician examine him before any disciplinary action. The physician discovered a serious chest condition. Aldous received treatment and lighter duties instead of dismissal. None of these acts were performed for recognition. Thessaly simply noticed suffering as naturally as most people notice furniture, automatically, constantly, without needing to decide whether it mattered. Servants began holding doors for her without being asked. Kitchen staff saved the warmest bread rolls for her tray each morning. Groundskeepers touched their caps when she passed through the gardens, but nobody with authority inside the Blackmere estate noticed any of it. Corvin never visited the east corridor where Thessaly's room was located. Delphinia, who spent most weekends at the estate preparing for the wedding, treated Thessaly as though she were part of the architecture, something that existed in the background without requiring acknowledgement. And Thessaly expected nothing different. She had spent 29 years learning that kindness rarely attracted attention from the people positioned above her. She performed it anyway, because kindness was not something she did for reward. It was simply who she was when nobody important was watching. The cruelty inside the Blackmere estate never arrived loudly. It settled like frost, so gradually that by the time Thessaly recognized it fully, the cold had already reached her bones. Delphinia visited the estate most weekends to oversee wedding preparations, arriving in carriages loaded with fabric samples, imported lace, and exhausted seamstresses from London. During those visits, she occupied the household completely. Servants redirected their attention toward her the moment her carriage appeared on the drive. Meals adjusted to her preferences. Rooms rearranged according to her instructions. The estate bent itself around Delphinia, the way iron bends under sustained heat, slowly and permanently. In the presence of guests, Delphinia treated Thessaly with polished indifference, the kind of disregard so smooth it appeared almost generous. She spoke past her during conversations, addressed questions to whoever stood nearest without acknowledging Thessaly existed, and smiled with the particular warmth reserved for people whose feelings carry no consequence. In private, the indifference sharpened. One evening, Thessaly entered the upstairs sitting room to retrieve a book Isabeau had requested, and found Delphinia seated beside the fire with 2 visiting friends. Their conversation stopped the moment Thessaly appeared. Delphinia studied her for a moment before speaking. "I sometimes forget she lives here. Is that terrible of me?" Her friends laughed softly while Thessaly collected the book and left without responding. Behind the closed door, the laughter continued. Corvin's contribution to the cruelty was simpler, and in some ways more painful. He never mocked Thessaly. He simply behaved as though she were not there. On the rare occasions they occupied the same room, his eyes passed over her as they passed over furniture, registering the object without processing the person. He avoided addressing her directly, never once asking about his grandmother's welfare in Thessaly's presence. Every inquiry went through Huxley or another servant, as though Thessaly were a mechanism rather than a companion, something that functioned without requiring conversation. One afternoon, Thessaly passed the open door of Corvin's study while carrying pressed wildflowers for Isabeau's writing desk. Inside, she heard Huxley speaking carefully. "The Dowager Duchess seems considerably improved these past weeks, Your Grace. Miss Varnum has been quite attentive." A pause followed before Corvin answered, without looking up from his correspondence. "Then the arrangement serves its purpose. 5 words. That was all Thessaly's presence inside his household amounted to in Corvin's estimation. A functioning arrangement." She continued walking before the silence betrayed her standing there. Later that same week, a letter arrived from Willowmere. Lady Margot wrote infrequently, and always briefly. This letter contained 3 short paragraphs. The first described Ondine's growing courtship with a baronet's son. The second mentioned Lucette's successful appearance at a London gathering hosted by a countess. The third consisted of a single sentence. "We trust you are conducting yourself appropriately and causing no difficulties for the Blackmere household. No question about her health. No mention of missing her. No warmth folded between the words. Only the ongoing instruction that had followed Thessaly her entire life. Be useful. Be invisible. Cause no trouble." She folded the letter carefully, placed it inside her writing desk, and returned to preparing Isabeau's evening tea as though nothing had changed. Because inside the Blackmere estate, nothing had. Thessaly remained exactly what everyone expected her to be: present, functional, and entirely forgettable. Except to the people no one considered important enough to ask. The wedding preparations transformed the Blackmere estate over the following weeks into something Thessaly barely recognized. An army of decorators descended upon the property, carrying enormous rolls of ivory damask, crates of crystal glassware etched with the Blackmere crest, and hundreds of white candles packed carefully in straw-lined boxes. Florists arrived daily from 3 different counties, unloading cartloads of pale peonies, winter jasmine, and forced lilac branches that filled the corridors with sweetness, so dense it became almost suffocating. The ballroom ceiling received new gilding. The grand staircase was wrapped in garlands of silk ribbon and dried orange blossoms. Even the gravel on the front drive was raked fresh each morning in anticipation of the growing number of visitors arriving to witness the preparations. Delphinia oversaw everything with the authority of someone who already considered herself Duchess. She approved menus, rejected tablecloth patterns, criticized flower arrangements, and sent seamstresses back to London twice after declaring their lacework insufficiently fine. Her confidence filled every room she entered. Servants obeyed her instructions before she finished speaking them. Behind every polished surface and perfectly arranged detail, Thessaly worked. She managed the logistics that Delphinia considered beneath her attention. Guest room linens inspected and replaced where necessary. Kitchen inventories counted and recounted to ensure provisions would survive 3 days of continuous entertaining. Servants' schedules reorganized to prevent exhaustion before the main celebration even began. Disputes between decorators and household staff settled without fuss before they became disruptions. Damaged glassware replaced from storage before anyone noticed the shortage. Thessaly handled every invisible emergency with the same steady competence she had carried her entire life. And once again, not a single person with authority thanked her for any of it. The pre-wedding banquet arrived on a cold Saturday evening in late April. Nearly 100 guests filled the Blackmere ballroom, their jewelry catching candlelight like scattered constellations beneath the gilded ceiling. Long tables overflowed with braised lamb shoulders glazed in rosemary butter, whole roasted pheasants arranged on beds of watercress, creamed leeks, parsnip soup served in silver tureens, warm bread rolls dusted with sea salt, and towering displays of crystallized fruit beside wheels of aged cheddar and Stilton. Wine flowed constantly from decanters that servants refilled before they ever reached empty. Delphinia stood at the center of the head table beside Corvin, magnificent in pale gold satin with pearls threaded through her auburn hair. She raised her glass gracefully. To the future Duchess of Blackmere, someone called from across the room. To the most beautiful bride England has seen in a generation, another added immediately. Applause rippled warmly through the ballroom. Delphinia accepted the praise with a smile so perfectly balanced between modesty and satisfaction that it seemed rehearsed, because it almost certainly was. Thessaly sat at the far end of the table beside Isabeau, wearing a simple gray dress she had owned for 3 years. She ate without speaking, while celebration surrounded her, like weather she was not permitted to participate in. Then, Delphinia's voice carried across the table during a lull between toasts. "Isabeau, you really must tell me where you found your companion. She has been so wonderfully useful these past weeks. I could almost mistake her for senior staff." The compliment was engineered precisely. It praised Thessaly's usefulness, while confirming her status as something less than a guest, less than family, less than anyone who belonged at the table she was seated at. Several guests smiled politely. A few glanced toward Thessaly with the awkward sympathy people reserve for public discomfort they have no intention of interrupting. Corvin said nothing. Ondine would have fired something sharp in return. Lucette would have smiled through it and calculated revenge later. Thessaly simply lowered her eyes toward her plate and continued eating as though the words had passed through her without landing. But they had landed. Every syllable. After supper, dancing began beneath the chandeliers, while musicians played waltzes imported from Vienna. Thessaly excused herself from the ballroom and walked quickly through the service corridor toward the garden door at the rear of the estate. Cold night air struck her face the moment she stepped outside, and she pressed both hands flat against the stone wall, breathing unevenly, while the distant sound of music and laughter drifted through the windows above her. She refused to cry. She had trained herself years ago to hold tears until she reached complete privacy. But standing alone outside the celebration she had spent weeks preparing for, wearing a dress nobody noticed, carrying exhaustion nobody acknowledged, Thessaly felt something dangerously close to breaking inside her chest. Then footsteps approached from behind her in the darkness. "You will catch a terrible chill standing out here without a coat." Thessaly turned quickly, wiping her face instinctively, though no tears had fallen yet. Isabeau stood in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, her expression unreadable in the dim light spilling from the corridor behind her. "I am fine, Your Grace. I simply needed air." The Dowager Duchess studied her for several long seconds. "You remind me of someone I loved very much," she said quietly. "Someone who believed enduring pain silently was the same as being strong. It is not, Thessaly. It never was." The words struck something deep enough that Thessaly could not answer immediately. She stood motionless in the cold, while the old woman watched her with an expression that contained no pity, only recognition. Then Isabeau extended her hand. "Come inside. You have survived enough cold for one evening." Thessaly took her hand, and for the first time since arriving at the Blackmere estate, she felt something other than invisible. But the warmth of that moment could not protect her from the question that followed her everywhere. How had Thessaly Varnum, a woman who once carried laughter inside her like sunlight, become someone who stood outside celebrations in the dark, grateful simply to be noticed by an elderly woman's kindness? The answer waited years in the past, inside a summer that had once changed everything. At 21, Thessaly Varnum had been a different person entirely. She walked through the Willowmere Gardens barefoot on warm afternoons, carrying volumes of poetry tucked beneath her arm, while honeybees drifted lazily between the lavender borders. She sang while arranging flowers in the morning room. She debated philosophy with visiting scholars during dinners, sometimes so passionately that Lord Fenwick cleared his throat in warning from across the table. She laughed openly, and often, with the particular freedom of someone who had not yet learned what the world intended to cost her. That was the summer Emmerich Calloway arrived in Willowmere. Emmerich came from modest circumstances. His father had been a country physician in Derbyshire, respected locally, but possessing neither title nor significant wealth. Emmerich followed the same profession, completing his training in Edinburgh, before accepting an invitation to assist the aging doctor serving the parishes surrounding Willowmere. He arrived carrying 2 leather cases of medical instruments, a trunk of well-worn books, and a quietness about him that people frequently mistook for shyness until he spoke. He was not shy. He was simply someone who listened before he talked, which made him unusual among the men Thessaly had encountered in society, where conversation often meant waiting for your turn to perform. Their first meeting happened accidentally. Thessaly had been walking near the village when she noticed a small crowd gathered outside the apothecary. A farm worker's young daughter had fallen from a stone wall and broken her wrist badly. The child was screaming while her father held her helplessly, unsure whether to move her or wait for assistance. Several villagers stood watching with concern, but doing nothing practical. Emmerich knelt beside the girl calmly, speaking to her with a steadiness that slowly quieted her panic. He examined the wrist carefully, explaining each movement before making it so the child understood what was happening. Within minutes, he had stabilized the injury with a temporary splint fashioned from wooden slats and strips of clean linen, and the girl's crying had reduced to quiet sniffling against her father's shoulder. Thessaly watched the entire scene from the edge of the crowd. What struck her was not his competence, though that was evident. It was the way he treated the child's fear as something that mattered as much as the injury itself. She introduced herself afterward, while he was cleaning his instruments beside the apothecary entrance. They discussed the properties of willow bark for pain relief, which led to a longer conversation about botanical remedies, which led to Thessaly mentioning a book on medicinal herbs in the Varnum Library that she thought he might find useful. He visited the estate the following week to borrow the book. That visit lasted nearly 3 hours. Within a month, their meetings had become the fixed point around which Thessaly's weeks quietly revolved. They walked together along the river paths outside the village, discussing everything from surgical techniques to poetry to the migration patterns of swallows. Emmerich never spoke to her the way society men did, performing compliments designed to flatter without meaning anything. He asked her opinions and listened to her answers with genuine attention. He challenged ideas she expressed and accepted correction when she proved him wrong, without embarrassment or defensiveness. For the first time in her life, Thessaly felt seen by someone whose seeing was not conditional on her appearance, her family's wealth, or her usefulness. Emmerich admired her mind. He admired her kindness toward the servants and tenants. He admired the way she noticed small suffering that others walked past, and he told her these things directly, without performance, because honesty was simply how he moved through the world. By autumn, Thessaly understood she was in love with a certainty that frightened her. The destruction came swiftly. Lord Fenwick discovered the attachment through a servant who mentioned seeing Thessaly and the young physician walking together near the river for the 3rd consecutive week. The confrontation happened that same evening inside the study, with Lady Margot standing rigid beside the mantelpiece. Lord Fenwick did not shout. His anger expressed itself through coldness, which was always worse. You have been associating privately with a man who possesses no title, no estate, no connections, and no future beyond tending to farmers and tradesmen. Do you understand what this does to our family if society learns of it? Father, he is a respected physician. He is educated and principled. And he is no one, Lord Fenwick interrupted flatly. And you will end this association immediately, or I will end it for you. Thessaly turned toward her mother desperately. Lady Margot studied the carpet without meeting her daughter's eyes. Your father is right, Thessaly. Attachment without advantage is a luxury this family cannot afford, especially from you. The final two words carried the weight of everything her family believed about her. Especially from you, the daughter with the fewest prospects, the daughter who could least afford to waste what little value remained. Lord Fenwick wrote to Emmerich personally the following morning, forbidding further contact and making clear that any attempt to continue the association would result in professional consequences arranged through the Varnum family's remaining social connections. Emmerich had no title, no patron, and no protection against a nobleman's displeasure, however diminished that nobleman's actual fortune had become. Thessaly begged for the chance to say goodbye. Lord Fenwick refused. She learned through a village servant 3 weeks later that Emmerich had accepted a position with a charitable medical mission operating in the industrial cities of the north. He had left Willowmere without sending word, though whether by choice or because Lord Fenwick had intercepted correspondence, Thessaly never discovered. 7 months later, a brief notice appeared in a medical journal that arrived at the Willowmere Library. Dr. Emmerich Calloway had died of typhus contracted while treating patients in a factory district outside Manchester. He was 26 years old. Thessaly read the notice twice, standing motionless between the library shelves, while winter light fell gray and thin through the window beside her. Then she closed the journal carefully, returned it to its place on the shelf, and walked upstairs to her room, where she sat at the edge of her bed without moving for the remainder of the afternoon. She never screamed or collapsed or refused food for days, the way grief is sometimes described in novels. Her mourning was quieter than that, and far more permanent. Something essential simply departed from inside her, like color draining from fabric left too long in sunlight. The laughter stopped. The singing stopped. The barefoot walks through the garden stopped. The passionate dinner conversation stopped. What remained was competence, endurance, and a gentleness toward suffering that only deepened because she now understood exactly how much suffering could cost. Her family noticed the change without understanding it or caring to investigate. Lady Margot observed that Thessaly had become more manageable. Lord Fenwick approved of the increased quietness. Neither connected it to the young physician they had driven away. Neither asked. And Thessaly carried that silence forward through the years, like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat, invisible to everyone, felt constantly by her alone. The weeks following the pre-wedding banquet brought a new kind of cruelty that Thessaly had not anticipated. Delphinia had noticed something that disturbed her, not because she feared Thessaly as a rival, but because she feared anything inside the household that did not orbit entirely around herself. It began with small corrections. Miss Varnum, I prefer the flowers arranged symmetrically in the east drawing room. You placed them off-center yesterday. Please correct that before our guests arrive. The flowers had been arranged according to Isabeau's preference, which Thessaly had honored for weeks. But challenging Delphinia openly was impossible, so Thessaly rearranged them each morning without a word and replaced them without comment each evening after Delphinia retired. Then the corrections escalated into instructions designed to humiliate. During a luncheon attended by several of Delphinia's closest friends, she addressed Thessaly directly across the table with a smile wrapped around something sharp. Miss Varnum, would you mind terribly checking with the kitchen whether the second course has been delayed? You know the household rhythms so much better than I do. You practically live among the staff. The women beside Delphinia exchanged amused glances. Thessaly rose without expression and walked toward the kitchen, while quiet laughter followed her through the doorway. That same week, a letter arrived from Willowmere. Ondine was formally engaged to Sir Aldrin Pembroke, a baronet's son with a profitable estate in Hampshire. Lady Margot's letter described the match with undisguised triumph. Your sister has secured exactly the future we always hoped for this family. The wedding will take place in August. Your father is immensely proud. We trust your position at Blackmere remains stable, and that you continue giving satisfaction. Giving satisfaction. The phrase reduced Thessaly's entire existence to the language of a servant's employment reference. She set the letter beside the previous one inside her writing desk without responding. The following Sunday, Delphinia hosted an intimate afternoon gathering in the conservatory for a small circle of noblewomen from neighboring counties. Thessaly was not invited, but was asked to ensure the tea service ran smoothly, which meant she spent the afternoon carrying trays, refilling teapots, and replacing pastry plates, while the women discussed the upcoming wedding in voices deliberately loud enough for her to hear. I must say, Delphinia, you have managed this household transformation beautifully, one woman observed. Even the charity cases seem well managed. Laughter followed. Thessaly set down a fresh plate of lemon cakes and turned toward the door. Delphinia spoke behind her. Miss Varnum, before you go, the sugar bowl on the far table needs refilling. Thank you so much. The gratitude was performance. Every woman in the room understood it. That evening, Thessaly sat alone in her room, while the estate settled into nighttime quiet around her. She had not cried since the evening beside the garden wall, when Isabeau found her. She had believed that moment represented a turning point, a crack in the isolation that might slowly widen into something bearable. But weeks had passed since then, and nothing had widened. Isabeau's kindness remained private. Corvin's indifference remained complete. Delphinia's cruelty grew bolder with every passing day, as though testing exactly how much pressure was required to make Thessaly finally break and leave. And for the first time since arriving at the Blackmere estate, Thessaly considered whether leaving was the only honest option remaining. Then a conversation she was never meant to hear changed everything. She had been walking through the upper corridor toward Isabeau's rooms when voices carried clearly from Corvin's study below. The door was partially open, and Delphinia's voice cut through the quiet house with its usual precision. I want her gone before the wedding, Corvin. She unsettles me. She watches everything too closely for someone in her position. Corvin's reply came slowly. She tends to my grandmother. That is her purpose here. Your grandmother managed perfectly well before this woman arrived, and will manage afterward. Delphinia's voice tightened. I have noticed the servants developing an absurd loyalty toward her. The kitchen staff, the groundskeepers, even the stable hands ask after her when she is absent. That kind of attachment is inappropriate for someone of her standing inside this household. A pause followed. Delphinia continued more softly, adjusting her tone toward something that resembled vulnerability. I simply want our home to feel like ours when we begin our marriage. Surely you can understand that. Thessaly stood frozen in the corridor above, both hands pressed flat against the wall beside her, listening to the silence that followed. Then Corvin spoke. I will consider it after the wedding. There is too much disruption already without adding more. The words were not a defense, they were a delay. And delays, Thessaly understood from a lifetime of experience, simply meant the decision had already been made, but the timing had not yet become convenient. She walked to Isabeau's room on unsteady legs, delivered the evening tea with hands that trembled only slightly, and said nothing about what she had overheard, because there was nothing to say. The people with power over her life had once again decided her future inside a room she was not permitted to enter, and once again, nobody had considered asking her what she wanted. That night, lying in the narrow bed inside the east corridor room, Thessaly stared at the ceiling, while rain tapped steadily against the window glass. She thought about Willowmere, where she was a burden. She thought about Blackmere, where she was a temporary arrangement. She thought about Emmerich, who had been the only person to ever look at her and see someone worth choosing. And she wondered, with a tiredness that reached deeper than her body, whether there existed anywhere in England where Thessaly Varnum was not simply waiting to be sent away. What Thessaly did not understand, because nobody outside the Blackmere family understood it fully, was that Duke Corvin Blackmere was a man trapped inside a decision he had made for reasons that no longer applied to who he had become. Corvin had not always been cold. As a young man, he carried an intensity that people around him found both compelling and difficult. He read voraciously, debated fiercely with his tutors, rode horses with reckless confidence, and laughed with an openness that Isabeau still remembered with painful clarity because it had disappeared so completely. The change began with Ginevra Ashcroft. Corvin met Ginevra during his second London season at a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance. She was the daughter of a viscount with declining finances, though that detail was concealed carefully behind impeccable taste, expensive gowns likely purchased on credit, and social skills so polished they appeared effortless. Ginevra possessed a particular talent for making whoever she spoke with feel as though they were the most important person she had ever encountered. Her attention felt like sunlight narrowed into a single beam, warm and impossibly focused. Corvin, who had spent years surrounded by women interested primarily in his title and estates, believed Ginevra was different. She asked about his thoughts rather than his properties. She remembered details from previous conversations and returned to them weeks later, creating an illusion of intimacy so convincing that Corvin lowered emotional defenses he had maintained since adolescence. Within 6 months, he proposed. Within 7, he began planning renovations to the east wing of the Blackmere estate to accommodate their future household. Within 8, he discovered through an intercepted letter that Ginevra had been conducting a parallel courtship with Lord Ashworth Pennington throughout their entire relationship, comparing offers and calculating which marriage provided greater financial recovery for her family. The letter itself contained a passage that embedded itself permanently inside Corvin's memory. She had written to a confidant describing Corvin as wonderfully earnest, which makes management simple. He believes sincerity because he possesses it himself. That is always the easiest kind of man to direct. Corvin ended the engagement privately, without public confrontation, because pride demanded the humiliation remain contained. Society interpreted the broken engagement as mutual. Ginevra married Lord Pennington 4 months later and was reportedly content with the arrangement, but the damage inside Corvin operated on a different timeline than the social recovery. He never stopped trusting women specifically. What he stopped trusting was the feeling of being understood. Warmth became suspicious. Genuine attention became a possible strategy. Kindness became something to examine for the mechanism hidden behind it. Isabeau watched the transformation with growing alarm. "You are building walls where doors should remain open," she told him one evening beside the library fire, months after Ginevra's departure. "Walls serve a practical function," he replied, without looking up from his book. "So do prisons." He offered no reply. When Delphinia Sable entered his life 2 years later, Corvin understood exactly what she was and chose her precisely because of it. Delphinia was beautiful, socially brilliant, and entirely transactional. She wanted the Blackmere title, the estates, and the status attached to becoming a duchess. She did not pretend otherwise, at least not to Corvin privately. Their arrangement was legible. The terms were clear. Nothing about their engagement required Corvin to believe he was loved, which meant nothing about it could wound him the way Ginevra had. Isabeau despised the match from the first meeting. "She is performing a role, Corvin. The only difference between this woman and the last is that this one is more honest about the performance. That is precisely why I chose her." Isabeau studied her grandson with an expression caught between anger and grief. "You chose her because she cannot hurt you. That is not the same as choosing someone who can love you." Corvin closed the subject by leaving the room, which had become his preferred method of ending conversations. He did not wish to continue. In the month since, the engagement had progressed with mechanical efficiency. Wedding plans advanced. Guest lists expanded. Deposits were placed with caterers, musicians, and decorators. Delphinia managed every detail with the competence of someone organizing a military campaign rather than a marriage. And Corvin moved through the preparations like a man walking a familiar road in complete darkness, steady and certain of the direction, without any clear sense of where it actually led. He had told Huxley that Thessaly would not last a week because experience had taught him that people who appeared gentle were always the first to retreat when circumstances became uncomfortable. Gentleness, in his understanding, was a luxury maintained only when nothing difficult was demanded of the person possessing it. He had not anticipated that gentleness could also be a form of endurance more stubborn and durable than any wall he had ever constructed. And he had certainly not anticipated that discovering this would matter to him at all. The shift happened not in a single moment, but through an accumulation of observations that Corvin could not stop making once they began. It started with Isabeau. Corvin visited his grandmother's rooms one morning to discuss a financial matter related to her personal accounts. He arrived earlier than expected and found Thessaly seated beside the old woman's bed, holding her hand, while Isabeau breathed through what was clearly significant pain in her joints. No servant was present. No audience existed. Thessaly was simply sitting with her, speaking quietly about the wildflowers beginning to appear along the south garden wall, describing their colors and positions so precisely that Isabeau could picture them without leaving her bed. Corvin stood outside the partially open door for nearly a minute before either woman noticed him. When Thessaly looked up and saw him standing there, something flickered briefly across her expression. Not fear, not embarrassment. Something closer to a question she had already decided not to ask. The financial matter was resolved in minutes, but the image of Thessaly holding his grandmother's hand stayed with Corvin throughout the afternoon in a way he could not dismiss. Then came the incident with the governess's daughter. The Blackmere estate employed a governess named Mrs. Pemberton for the children of senior household staff. Her daughter, a girl of 9 named Rosalind, had developed a persistent cough throughout the spring that Mrs. Pemberton attributed to seasonal dampness and treated with broth and rest. Thessaly had been watching the cough for days without drawing attention, recognizing from her years around Emmerich's medical conversations a pattern that suggested something more serious than seasonal irritation. Without alarming anyone, Thessaly requested that Huxley arrange for the estate physician to examine the child during his next routine visit. The physician discovered early signs of a respiratory condition that required immediate treatment. Had it progressed another 2 weeks untreated, the consequences could have been severe. Mrs. Pemberton wept with gratitude inside the kitchen while Britta served her tea. Thessaly had already returned to Isabeau's rooms by the time anyone thought to thank her. Corvin learned about the incident from Huxley, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a butler who understood more than he ever said aloud. Miss Varnum requested the physician's visit, Your Grace. She recognized the symptoms before anyone else noticed. Corvin paused over his correspondence. She has medical knowledge. She appears to have learned a considerable amount from somewhere, Your Grace. Huxley hesitated, then added, The staff trust her judgment in such matters. They have for some time. The remark sat inside Corvin's thoughts, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward into questions he had never considered asking before. How long had Thessaly been quietly managing crises inside his household? How many problems had she solved that he had never learned about because they had been resolved before they reached his attention? How many people inside his own estate knew her better than he did? The answer, he slowly realized, was nearly everyone. The moment that broke everything open arrived during a formal dinner 3 weeks before the wedding. 30 guests filled the dining hall for what Delphinia described as the final celebration before the ceremony itself. Silver candelabras lined the long table between platters of roasted guinea fowl, grilled asparagus dressed in hollandaise, potatoes whipped with cream and chives, cold salmon arranged on beds of dill, and towers of profiteroles filled with chocolate custard. The room hummed with conversation and wine-fueled warmth, while musicians played softly from the gallery above. Midway through the second course, Isabeau began coughing. The cough persisted longer than it should have, drawing concerned glances from nearby guests. The Dowager Duchess gripped her napkin tightly, her face paling as the episode refused to pass. Several guests turned in alarm. Conversation stopped in waves across the table. Delphinia glanced toward Isabeau with visible irritation before addressing the nearest servant. "Please assist the Dowager Duchess to her rooms. She clearly needs rest." The instruction was delivered with the tone of someone managing an inconvenience rather than responding to a crisis. She turned back to her guests immediately. "I do apologize. Shall we continue?" But Thessaly was already moving. She reached Isabeau's side within seconds, one hand supporting the old woman's back, while the other loosened the high collar pressing against her throat. She spoke calmly and directly into Isabeau's ear, while the rest of the table watched in frozen uncertainty. "Lean forward slightly. Breathe through your nose. I am right here." Isabeau's trembling hand found Thessaly's wrist and gripped it with desperate strength. Thessaly did not flinch. She held the old woman steady while sending a servant for warm water and the herbal preparation she kept in Isabeau's rooms for exactly this kind of episode. Within several minutes, the coughing subsided. Color slowly returned to Isabeau's face. Thessaly remained beside her, one arm around her shoulders, speaking softly until the Dowager Duchess nodded to indicate she could breathe normally again. The dining hall had gone completely silent. Corvin stared at Thessaly from across the table. He had watched Delphinia dismiss his grandmother like an inconvenient piece of furniture. And he had watched a woman his household had treated as barely more than a servant, save her with the kind of competence and tenderness that could not be performed, because performance required awareness of an audience. And Thessaly had clearly forgotten that anyone else in the room existed the moment Isabeau stopped breathing properly. Something fractured inside Corvin's chest, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Later that evening, after the guests departed and the dining hall emptied, Corvin walked alone through the darkened corridors of the estate until he reached the east wing. He stood outside Isabeau's door and listened to the quiet sound of Thessaly reading aloud inside, her voice steady and warm in the hush. He neither knocked nor entered, but he stood there for a long time. The following morning, Huxley noticed something he had never seen before. Duke Corvin Blackmere asked where Miss Varnum was before asking about anything else. The change inside the Blackmere estate happened so gradually that most people failed to recognize it until the consequences became impossible to ignore. It began with questions. Corvin started inquiring about his grandmother through Thessaly directly, rather than through Huxley. The conversations were brief at first, formal and carefully contained, as though testing whether a door long kept locked might still open. "How is she today?" "Improved. She slept better last night after I adjusted the pillow arrangement. The pain is worse when her neck remains at certain angles." "You learned that from observation?" "I learned that from asking her. She knows her body better than anyone. She simply needs someone willing to listen." Corvin studied Thessaly during that exchange, like a man reading a sentence in a language he was only beginning to understand. Then he nodded and walked away without further comment. But he returned the following morning with the same question. And the morning after that. Within 2 weeks, the questions had expanded beyond Isabeau's health. Corvin asked about the servants' welfare. He asked about kitchen supply shortages Thessaly had been handling without acknowledgement for months. He asked whether the estate physician was visiting frequently enough. He asked questions that revealed, with increasing discomfort, How much of his own household had been functioning under Thessaly's invisible management without his knowledge or gratitude? Delphinia noticed immediately. She tracked Corvin's movements through the estate with the attentiveness of someone who had built her entire future upon a single investment and now sensed fluctuation in its value. She observed the conversations with Thessaly growing longer. She observed Corvin arriving at meals later because he had visited Isabeau's rooms first. She observed the servant's posture changing subtly whenever Thessaly passed, a warmth and attentiveness that they had never extended toward Delphinia despite months of effort and command. The jealousy that grew inside Delphinia was not romantic. She did not love Corvin, and never had. What she feared losing was control over a household she had spent months reshaping in her own image and the title that accompanied it. Thessaly represented a disruption to the architecture of Delphinia's future, and Delphinia responded the way she always responded to threats. She attacked. The first strike came through social maneuvering. During an afternoon visit from Lady Hargrove, one of the most influential gossips in the county, Delphinia mentioned casually that the Varnum family's finances had deteriorated so significantly that their eldest daughter had been placed essentially as a domestic dependent inside the Blackmere household. "One does feel sympathy," Delphinia murmured while pouring tea. "But charity must have limits, particularly when it creates confusion about a person's actual position within the household." Lady Hargrove carried the information home like a trophy. Within days, whispers circulated through neighboring estates about the Varnum girl living above her station at Blackmere under the pretense of companionship. The second strike was more direct. Delphinia requested that Thessaly be removed from the guest list for the wedding ceremony itself, arguing that her presence among titled guests would create awkwardness given her ambiguous social standing. She brought the request to Corvin in his study, confident of agreement. "It is simply a matter of appropriateness, darling. I am certain she would be more comfortable observing from a separate area." Corvin looked up from his desk with an expression Delphinia had not seen before. Something had changed behind his eyes, though she could not yet identify precisely what. "Miss Varnum will be seated with the household. She is not a servant." The refusal was quiet. It was also the first time Corvin had denied Delphinia anything directly since their engagement began. Delphinia smiled and changed the subject. But behind that smile, something tightened. Meanwhile, the cracks inside Delphinia's own character widened under pressure. Servants reported her shouting at kitchen staff when dishes arrived imperfectly presented. She dismissed a young maid for folding napkins incorrectly during a luncheon, an offense so minor that Huxley quietly rehired the girl the following morning. She complained to visitors about the estate's furnishings with a familiarity that implied ownership months before the wedding had granted it. Britta, who had tolerated Delphinia with professional restraint for months, finally spoke privately to Thessaly one evening while the kitchen emptied after supper. "That woman will strip this household bare once she carries the title. Every person who works here knows it. You are the only reason half the staff have not already started looking for positions elsewhere." Thessaly shook her head. "She will be Duchess. It is not my place to interfere with that." Britta looked at her with an expression that mixed affection with frustration. Perhaps not. But someone should. The wedding was now 12 days away, and inside the Blackmere estate, two entirely different futures were pulling against each other, like tides moving in opposite directions beneath the same surface. One built on transaction and performance, the other on something quieter that nobody had yet found the courage to name. The morning of the wedding rehearsal dinner arrived beneath a sky so perfectly clear that even the servants commented on it, as though the weather itself had decided to perform for Delphinia's benefit. The Blackmere estate gleamed with 3 months of preparation. Every surface polished, every flower arranged, every candle positioned to cast the most flattering light across the ballroom, where 140 guests would gather that evening for the final celebration before the ceremony itself. Delphinia moved through the preparations with absolute command, adjusting centerpieces, redirecting servants, approving the musicians' repertoire, and inspecting the dining hall with the focus of a general surveying a battlefield before engagement. Her gown for the evening, commissioned from London's most celebrated dressmaker, hung inside her chambers in pale silver silk, embroidered with tiny crystals that would catch every flicker of candlelight in the room. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was permitted to be less than perfect. Thessaly spent the morning with Isabeau, who had declined attending the dinner, despite pressure from Corvin. "I have watched enough performances to last several lifetimes," the Dowager Duchess said dryly, while Thessaly arranged wildflowers beside her reading chair. "I prefer honest company this evening." She looked at Thessaly with an expression that carried more meaning than the words alone. "You should attend tonight, child. You have earned your place at that table more than anyone who will sit at it." Thessaly smiled but shook her head. "I would rather stay here with you." Isabeau studied her for a long moment. Then she said something Thessaly did not expect. "He sees you now, Thessaly. My grandson. He sees you the way that young physician in Willowmere once did. The way people see someone when they have finally stopped looking at what surrounds them and started looking at what stands quietly in front of them." Thessaly's hand stilled on the flower stems. She did not respond because she did not trust her voice. Isabeau continued gently. "Do not decide you are unworthy of being seen simply because others spent years refusing to look." That evening, 140 guests filled the Blackmere ballroom in a display of wealth and social power that drew gasps from those seeing the estate for the first time. Chandeliers blazed above tables, laden with silver tureens of chilled cucumber soup, platters of roasted guinea fowl and grilled asparagus dressed in hollandaise, wild mushroom tarts arranged beside towers of crystallized fruit, and pyramids of profiteroles filled with chocolate custard. Wine flowed endlessly from decanters that servants replaced before they ever ran dry. Delphinia presided over the head table beside Corvin, radiant and commanding in her silver gown, every gesture calculated to project the image of a woman born for the position she was about to inherit. She laughed at the right moments. She complimented guests with surgical precision. She touched Corvin's arm with practiced affection that communicated possession rather than warmth. Corvin sat beside her without speaking for most of the evening, responding to conversation when addressed directly, but offering nothing voluntarily. His eyes moved across the ballroom repeatedly, searching for something without acknowledging he was searching. Thessaly was not present. She had remained upstairs with Isabeau as planned. Halfway through supper, Delphinia rose to deliver the toast she had prepared for weeks. Her voice carried across the candlelit hall with practiced grace, speaking of legacy and honor and the life she had waited for. Every word was calibrated to project devotion without revealing ambition. The performance was flawless. Applause followed. Glasses rose across the room. Corvin lifted his without bringing it to his lips. Then Huxley appeared at Corvin's shoulder and leaned close. "Your Grace, the Dowager Duchess has collapsed. Miss Varnum is with her, but the physician must come at once. It is far worse than before." Corvin rose instantly, his chair scraping hard against the marble. Nearby guests fell silent. Delphinia's composure flickered for a fraction of a second, before reassembling. "Darling, what is it?" "My grandmother." Corvin was already moving toward the door. Delphinia reached for his arm. "We have guests, Corvin. Surely this can wait until after dessert." Corvin stopped walking. He turned slowly and looked at Delphinia, with an expression that the nearest guests would later describe to friends and neighbors across 3 counties. It was not anger. It was clarity. The particular kind of clarity that arrives when someone finally sees a thing they have been looking away from for a very long time. He said nothing to Delphinia. He turned and walked out of the ballroom. Upstairs, he found Isabeau propped against pillows, while Thessaly sat beside her, holding a damp cloth against the old woman's forehead with one hand and gripping her trembling fingers with the other. A small basin of herbal water rested on the bedside table, filling the room with the faint scent of chamomile and eucalyptus. Thessaly looked up when Corvin entered. Her eyes were calm despite the fear visible beneath them. Her breathing steadied a few minutes ago. The physician should examine her chest when he arrives, but I believe the worst has passed. Corvin stood in the doorway, looking at the scene before him. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him after his mother's death, the woman who had argued and fought and loved him more fiercely than anyone alive, was being held by a woman his household had spent months treating as invisible. Delphinia had not asked which room Isabeau was in. Corvin crossed the room and knelt beside his grandmother's bed. His hand found Isabeau's free hand, the one Thessaly was not already holding. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The ballroom celebration continued distantly below them, music and laughter drifting upward through the floorboards like sound from another world entirely. But inside that room, something had become undeniable. Isabeau opened her eyes slowly, saw both of them beside her, and managed a faint smile. "Took you long enough," she whispered hoarsely to her grandson. Corvin did not let go of her hand. The physician arrived within the hour and confirmed that Isabeau's condition, while serious, had been managed effectively by Thessaly's intervention. Rest, continued herbal treatment, and reduced exertion were prescribed. Corvin remained upstairs for the rest of the evening. He did not return to the ballroom. He did not return to Delphinia. The following morning, 12 hours before his wedding was scheduled to begin, Duke Corvin Blackmere called Delphinia into his study and closed the door. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Thessaly learned what happened the way servants learn most things inside great houses, through fragments overheard and assembled into a picture more complete than anyone with authority intended. Corvin had ended the engagement. The details that emerged afterward came in pieces. Huxley confirmed the basic facts with characteristic restraint. Britta supplied the household's reaction with considerably less restraint. A footman who had been stationed outside the study during the conversation reported that Delphinia's voice had risen sharply twice before falling into a silence more frightening than shouting. When Delphinia emerged from the study, her face carried the particular composure of someone whose fury has passed beyond expression into something colder and more permanent. She walked directly to her chambers, instructed her maid to begin packing immediately, and departed the Blackmere estate before noon in a carriage loaded with 11 trunks of wedding preparations that would never be used. She did not say goodbye to anyone. The cancellation of the wedding sent shockwaves through the county and beyond. 140 guests received handwritten notes of apology from Huxley. Caterers dismantled preparations that had taken weeks to assemble. Musicians who had traveled from London returned home unpaid, though Corvin later sent full compensation to every one of them. Florists collected thousands of flowers that would never decorate a ceremony. Society reacted with the mixture of horror and fascination that always accompanies the collapse of something everyone had publicly admired. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Delphinia had been discovered in an affair. Corvin had gone mad. Financial disputes had destroyed the arrangement. The Dowager Duchess had poisoned the relationship deliberately. Nobody suspected the truth because the truth was too quiet to make compelling gossip. A man had simply opened his eyes inside his own household and realized that the life he had been constructing was built on the wrong foundation entirely. For 3 days after the cancellation, Thessaly continued her duties with Isabeau as though nothing had changed. She never sought out Corvin. She asked no questions about the broken engagement. She refused to allow herself to interpret what had happened as something connected to her own presence inside the household, because a lifetime of disappointment had taught her that hope was the most dangerous luxury a person in her position could afford. Isabeau watched her granddaughter's companion with knowing patience, but said nothing further. Some doors, the old woman understood, needed to be opened by the person standing on the other side. On the fourth evening, Corvin found Thessaly in the garden. She was cutting lavender stems for Isabeau's room, kneeling in the soft earth beside the south wall, while the last light of the day stretched long golden shadows across the grass. She did not hear him approach until his shadow fell across the flowers in front of her. She looked up and saw him standing there with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The coldness was gone. The distance was gone. What remained was something unfinished and uncertain, like a sentence someone has been composing for weeks without finding the right words to complete it. "I owe you an apology," he said. Thessaly stood slowly, brushing soil from her hands. "For what, Your Grace?" "For the first words I ever spoke about you." Corvin's voice was steady but carried weight beneath it that Thessaly could feel the way you feel, weather changing before rain arrives. "I told Huxley you would not last a week inside this household. I believed that completely. I believed gentleness was a weakness that difficult circumstances would expose and destroy." He paused. "I was wrong. About gentleness. And about you." Thessaly held the lavender stems against her chest without speaking. Corvin took a single step closer. "You outlasted every expectation I placed upon you. You outlasted Delphinia's cruelty. You outlasted my indifference. You outlasted an engagement built on everything I thought mattered and proved, simply by being here, simply by being exactly who you are, that none of it mattered at all." Thessaly's vision blurred. She blinked hard, determined not to cry in front of him, but the tears came anyway, because some words reach places that composure cannot protect. Corvin reached into his coat and removed a small box covered in dark blue velvet. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a ring, unlike anything Delphinia had ever worn. No enormous diamond designed to impress a ballroom. Instead, a single pale sapphire surrounded by tiny seed pearls, set in gold so delicately worked it resembled the stem of a wildflower. It had been Isabeau's, the ring Corvin's grandfather had given the Dowager Duchess 62 years earlier, the ring Isabeau had placed in Corvin's hand 3 days ago, with 6 words that contained everything. "She is the one, Corvin." Thessaly stared at the ring while tears ran openly down her face. "I do not deserve this," she whispered. Corvin shook his head. "You deserve someone who saw you from the beginning. I cannot give you that. But I can promise you that I see you now, completely, and I will never look away again." The garden was silent except for birdsong and the distant sound of the household moving through its evening routines beyond the walls. No ballroom full of witnesses, no chandelier-lit spectacle, no audience of rivals and critics assembled to observe the moment. Just 2 people standing in a garden at the end of a long day, one of them holding wildflowers and the other holding a ring, and the quiet, enormous truth settling between them that the most powerful thing in the world is not wealth or status or beauty, but being truly known by someone who chose to stay. Thessaly nodded. "Yes." The word left her mouth barely louder than breathing, but Corvin heard it clearly enough. He placed the ring on her finger in the fading golden light, while lavender stems scattered softly across the garden path between them. 2 years passed. Thessaly became Duchess of Blackmere, not with the commanding entrance Delphinia had always envisioned, but with the same quiet steadiness she had carried into the household as a companion nobody expected to remember. She did not redecorate the estate dramatically or host grand events designed to announce her new status. Instead, she continued doing what she had always done, only now with the authority to do it openly. She expanded the estate physician's visits to include all tenant families without charge. She established a small school for servants' children inside the renovated East Wing. She learned every groundskeeper, stable hand, and kitchen worker by name, and continued treating them with the same respect she had shown when she held no title at all. Britta remained head cook and became one of her closest confidants. Phelim, the kitchen boy she had once bandaged, grew into a capable young apprentice who credited Miss Thessaly, as he still called her, despite correction, with saving his position years earlier. Isabeau lived to see her grandson married and spent her remaining seasons beside the garden wall she loved, surrounded by the wildflowers Thessaly maintained personally in every season. When the Dowager Duchess passed peacefully on a warm September afternoon, Thessaly was holding her hand exactly the way she had held it on that first, frightening evening, when breathing became difficult. The household mourned her deeply, and Corvin grieved openly for the first time in his adult life, because Thessaly had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness. It was trust. Delphinia Sable married a viscount the following year, in a ceremony reported extensively by London society papers. The marriage dissolved within 18 months amid rumors of financial disputes and mutual resentment. She never returned to the county where the Blackmere estate stood. The Varnum family received news of Thessaly's marriage with reactions that revealed more about themselves than about her. Lord Fenwick immediately attempted to re-establish contact, writing letters filled with sudden warmth and paternal pride that read as though he had simply misplaced his eldest daughter temporarily, rather than spent decades ignoring her. Lady Margot visited Blackmere once, 6 months after the wedding, and spent the entire afternoon studying the estate, with an expression caught between amazement and regret. She never apologized directly, but she held Thessaly's hand for a long time before departing, and the grip said things her words could not manage. Ondine and Lucette arrived separately over the following year, both carrying the particular exhaustion of women whose marriages had delivered status without companionship. Ondine's baronet proved more interested in hunting dogs than conversation. Lucette's carefully selected husband treated her with the same charming indifference she had once wielded so effectively against others. Neither sister asked Thessaly for help directly. They did not need to. Thessaly offered them rooms, warmth, kindness, and the company of someone who understood loneliness from the inside without needing it explained. Because Thessaly Varnum had never wanted revenge, she had never wanted to prove anyone wrong. She had simply wanted, for her entire life, to be seen clearly by the people around her. And when that finally happened, she responded the only way she knew how, with the same grace she had carried when nobody was watching. Years later, a new servant joined the Blackmere household and asked Huxley about the Duchess during her first week of employment. What is she like, truly? Huxley, who had served the estate for over 30 years and rarely offered personal opinions about the family he attended, paused before answering. When she arrived here, the Duke told me she would not last a week. That was nearly 3 years ago. She outlasted his engagement, his expectations, and every assumption this household ever made about her. He adjusted a silver tray on the hallway table with precise care. She is the strongest person I have ever known, and I do not believe she has any idea that she is. And the truth that the Blackmere estate learned, the truth that the Varnum family discovered too late, and the truth that Thessaly herself carried long before anyone else understood it, was simply this: the people the world overlooks are not weak. They are patient. And patience, when it is built on kindness rather than bitterness, is the kind of strength that outlasts everything.